Any other questions? Okay. All right, so does anyone see anything wrong with this example? It's pretty normal, right? Anybody? Yes? We don't have what on an input text?
You don't have an explanation about the input text. You don't know what it means.
Okay. All right. So you're saying there's no label for the input text. Yes, that is an error, but that's not the main one. But that's a good point. There's no label for the input control there. Yes, in the back. The value attribute should be a binding one. Ah, okay. So he's saying this really should be more of a binding or something than a value attribute. These are actually pretty good points, but not the main point. So maybe the example needs a little bit of work. All right. So this is what I call the nameless UI components anti-pattern. Okay. So this particular page, if it had a label and probably you need a converter, or maybe current widget is really a string, who knows, okay? But the problem here is that there are no IDs for the components, okay? So it's a perfectly valid page, it would work just fine, right? But nameless UI components have issues, okay? So if you do not set IDs for the components on your page, number one, it makes testing difficult. Has anyone ever tried recording a test script for a JSF page without IDs before? Anybody? Then you play it back later, and what happens? Right. The IDs change, and it doesn't work. Right. So that's probably one of the number one reasons. So if you record a test script with any test tool, any black box testing tool like Selenium or one of the more expensive commercial tools, whatever, they're not going to work unless you set the IDs for the page. Okay. The other thing is that it's hard to integrate with custom JavaScript or AJAX features. So if you have any custom JavaScript and you reference the IDs of the components on the page and the IDs change, well, then your JavaScript's going to break as well, right? So that's another problem. And another thing which happens is, depending on the JSF implementation, this may increase the size of the page. Okay, so let me see if I can bring up an example here. All right, so we'll start this page. All right, so this is a good example. Okay, so you probably can't see it, but all right, so this is just a page, okay? And you see there's no IDs here at all, right? So let's see if we can get to this page. Okay, so this is a JSF page. I'm not going to go into what the example is about, but you saw it had no IDs, right? So let's say I look at the source. Okay. So far, so good. Okay. Now, look here. So this is the name of the form, okay? And this is the name of this input control, right? JIDT21, okay? So, I run this later. That ID may be completely different, maybe JID24, 26, whatever, okay? And I have no control over how long this is. Okay, so with some JSF implementations, the default ID may be 2 or 3 times as long. So on a complicated page, let's say with a data table, where the ID is appended before every single row and every component inside of a row, it can get quite large. Okay, so you don't have any control over it. So keep that in mind. So and also, if I was writing JavaScript and I wanted to reference its input control, this is what I'd be looking for. Okay, number one, this doesn't really tell me anything about what the input control is for, right? And number two, it could change because it's not set to any value. Okay. All right. So this is why. Right. So that was actually operator error. So I zoomed in and I forgot I zoomed in. So all right. So okay. So, and of course, as you saw, it could increase the render size. I'd say probably the number one issue, though, is testing. It's actually impossible to test a JSF page black box testing without having an ID there. Okay. Okay. So here's an example with an ID, right? So ID is form, ID is name, button is submit. Okay, so now we actually have names. I know this input control is for the name. Don't try putting the type of component. Don't put like name input text or something, because if one day you decide to use a third-party component with a different name, all of a sudden it doesn't make any sense, right? So just try and use a meaningful name. Of course, you can use form because that's really what it is, right? But try and keep that in mind. So the idea is to use short, meaningful IDs. Okay. You want to put an ID on every input control, okay? Because an input control is what's actually posted back to the server, right? And you want to put an ID on components with AJAX behavior, because you may need to reference those in JavaScript, okay? Or let's say you're using the f-AJAX element, you need to reference that component using that element, right? So you want to say f-AJAX, process and put in the names of the IDs of the components you want to process. Well, if you don't put an ID on the components, you can't list them there, right? So you have to do that as well. You also want to put an ID on naming containers, okay? So a naming container, again, is a special component which ensures that its children have unique IDs, okay? So the most popular naming container is the form, okay? Every component inside of a form will have a unique ID. And another example is a data table, also very popular. And then you'll find other components depending on the component suite. So usually any sort of tree component, tree table, tab views, those sort of components are often naming containers, but that will depend on the component suite. Okay. Now the way the naming container achieves this uniqueness is by prepending itself to the ID of itself to the ID of the component inside of it. Okay, so the actual so you saw when I was looking at that page that it was like J whatever colon J whatever. Okay, the first one was the form, and the second one was the component inside of it. Okay, so the form ID is going to be prefixed to all the components inside of it when it's rendered back to the client. And that's what we call the client ID. Okay. So what you want to do is, if you have a naming container, is to give it an ID, and you want to make it as short as possible. Okay, because you don't want some long ID prefixed to every single row in a data table or every control in your form. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. So the most common thing is really a data table and a form. Okay. All right. Also, I recommend coming up with naming conventions. So if you're going to make people or encourage people to start using IDs, have some sort of naming convention for those. So usually it's best to write them down somewhere in a wiki or something. But you may say that anything that's a form is FRM, anything that's data table is DTB, or you may have some sort of other naming convention or something. Who knows? But just come up with some idea of what things should be named, because then things will be a lot easier for developers. And also this helps a lot for new people coming onto the project as well. Okay. But the most important thing is to give them IDs and make them short. Okay, long IDs can contribute to page bloat, essentially. Okay, so if you have a data table with 50 rows displayed, and your data table is called my big long data table, then my big long data table is going to be at the ID of every single component inside of that data table over and over again. Okay, and that can drastically increase the size of your page. Now imagine that you have a form called my form, and then a data table called my big long data table, and then an input control called name input. Okay, that's a pretty long string just for one field, because that's what it's going to be. It's going to be all three of those things. And then let's say you repeat that for 5 controls in each row, and you have 50 rows. Okay, all of a sudden you have a whole lot of weight in the page that's just the ID. Okay, so try and keep them short. All right, so another one we have is CSS style soup. Okay, that's basically just hard-coded styles in your JSF views. So if you have input controls or panels, etc., and every single one of them has a style attribute, and there's no real control over or standards about what should have styles and what shouldn't, the application becomes very hard to maintain. Okay. Now, how many people here use a third-party component suite like Rich Faces or Ice Faces or Trinidad or Prime Faces or something like that? Okay, so that's most of you, right? So if you do so, all of those component suites have some sort of theme or skinning sort of framework, right? What you can do is use CSS selectors instead of inline styles, okay? And I recommend that this be enforced sort of at a project level, or maybe there's rules. Maybe you always use a CSS selector unless the thing you're using the style attribute for is specific, owns that one control for that one time. Okay, maybe there's some sort of rules, but it's better to use CSS selectors. And remember that most component suites let you override the defaults. Okay, so let's say that there's a certain way the data table looks, but you want to make a minor change to it. Usually, if you look up a documentation for that data table, they'll tell you what the selectors are called. Right? So you can just override a couple properties if you want to change it, as opposed to putting a style attribute on top of the data table itself. Okay, and this way you can make it a global thing, and as opposed to having the same style repeated in every single page. Okay. And if you have a lot of customization to do, just develop a custom theme. Okay. All of those component suites have the ability to have a custom theme, and they make it very easy, pretty much. So you just pretty much have to go and use the right selectors and everything, and you can have a totally customized look and feel without hard coding styles all over the place. Okay. So keep that in mind. Definitely will make maintenance a lot easier to use CSS. Okay. All right, so another one is session overload. Okay. And this is basically when you put a lot of stuff in the session. And of course, the most common thing that people put in the session are the backing beans. They'll put all the beans in session scope because it's a little easier. You don't have to worry about what's available when, and everything just sort of works, right? The problem is that it takes up a lot of space. So, if you put all of your beans in session scope and session timeout period is like 30 minutes or an hour, and you have thousands of users, then your session gets very heavy and takes up lots of RAM, and you have scalability problems. Okay, so try to avoid that. And actually, the general rule is to, number one, try and put your beans in session in request scope. Excuse me, put it in request scope if you can. And what's great about request scope is there's no state, right? It just gets created, it does its work, and then goes away, right? So if you can put it in request scope. If request scope isn't good enough, you can always use the view scope in JSF2. And that means that it's kept around for the lifetime of the current view. Okay. If you wanted to live in between views and you instead of using session scope, you can use flash scope, which is also in JSF2. Flash scope lets you have something which is available in between subsequent views. So if you move from one page to another, it'll keep it. But if you go to a completely different page that wasn't related to those two, it'll go away. Okay? So that's a good way to keep a variable in between subsequent pages where you're going from one page to the next. Okay? If you're using JSF 1.x still, Seam has a page scope if you're using Seam 2.x. But also Tomahawk has the T-Safe State component, which is very similar to the view scope in JSF2. And Tomahawk works with any component suite, so you can just throw it in there and use that one tag. That's the best thing about Tomahawk. It's My Faces Tomahawk. It's an older component library, but it has some nice features in there. Rich Faces has an A4J keep alive, which was popular in an older version of Rich Faces. Okay, and that works very similar to the view scope in JSF2 as well. Okay, so there's other ways to do it if you're using JSF 1.x. You can also use the conversation scope. How many people here have used are using some sort of conversation scope? All right, so a few of you. Are you using Spring or CDI, or like who's using Spring for the conversation scope? Seam? Okay. CDI? Okay. All right. So a conversation scope is basically a scope which is longer than a request and shorter than a session, and you kind of have more control over how long it lasts. So whereas view is only like, while the user is looking at that page, conversation scope can usually be across several pages. So often it's used for something like a shopping cart or some sort of logical flow where you want to keep that state around for a few different pages, or maybe many pages. Okay, and you can do it with JBoss Seam. 2.x is probably the easiest way to do it. There is a Seam 3 as well. And then CDI, context for dependency injection for Java, has it. And the latest version of Spring has a conversation scope as well. Okay, so that's another scope you can use. Let's see. Oh yeah, My Faces Trinidad also has a page flow scope, which is very similar to the conversation scope as well. Yeah, and Spring Webflow has something similar as well too. So those are different ways to do it. And basically, basically, anytime we talk about one of these other scopes which are not in the servlet spec, we're basically talking about chopping up the session into a smaller maintainable chunk of memory, right? So that's essentially what we're talking about. But the more you do that, the less memory you'll use, because when the conversation is over, which you can do usually programmatically or based on whatever page someone goes to, that's when the memory will go away. Okay. All right. All right. So that is basically cool. The most of the anti-patterns. And I think there was, yes, there's one more anti-pattern actually, which I'll mention here. There's actually a few more which I haven't put on the slides yet, but the one I want to mention here is the sort of the AJAX overuse anti-pattern, which I think I mentioned something similar. But basically, AJAX is very cool, and I was saying earlier that there are one of the things you have to keep in mind is sort of the network latency, right? So one of the things I've run into a few times is where we have a situation where we want to do something where we're hiding and showing part of the page or something like that, and there's an AJAX request involved, right? And in some cases that works out very well. But there are cases where it doesn't, and what I find, the case where I find it doesn't is basically data entry, right? So you have someone whose job it is to sit there and use the application all day, right? And what they do is they tab through fields and they type stuff in and they try to do it very fast. So then they tab to some AJAX field and they tab out and they have to wait for something to happen. Now AJAX could be fast, but it may not be. So depending on your network and how your application is designed and things like that, that AJAX request may take a second, may take half a second, but maybe even a quarter of a second might be too long for someone who's trying to tab in between fields, right? So when you use AJAX, you need to think about actually when it makes sense for the user. Maybe there's a way to do that behavior client side. Maybe you have to write a little bit of JavaScript. Maybe you can use, if you really don't like JavaScript, some of these JSF components have some kind of special components that essentially write JavaScript for you, like Rich Faces has some of those, Prime Faces has some. But maybe you need to think about sort of that interaction, okay? Because at the end of the day, it's the user experience that matters, and if they're expecting a really fast response by just typing stuff, and hitting tab and things like that, and you have to wait for a round trip to occur to the server, even if it's just a smaller, even if you're only processing one field, that's delay they might actually perceive, okay? So I just want to mention that. I mean, I've had issues where, you're doing AJAX to hide and show like the next field or enable, disable, and it just doesn't, it's too slow, right? So maybe the problem is that there's, the server's too slow. Maybe the problem is, they're running over a slow internal network, okay? Or maybe just not a good case for AJAX. That may be the case. Maybe you have to write some JavaScript. So keep that in mind. One of the things also that will also help with overall AJAX performance, in JSF 2.1, there will be this new feature called partial submit. So one of the sort of, what I think is the flaws in the JSF 2 AJAX is that whenever you do an AJAX request, even if you're processing one component, it submits the entire form, okay? So if you have a huge form and you're processing one component, then all that data is being sent over the network, and it's really not even required for what's happening. So in JSF 2.1, there will be a partial submit so that it'll only submit the fields that need to be submitted for the AJAX request, which will reduce the time, okay? And Prime Faces actually just added that as a special feature to its AJAX support. So that's something to look into as well. So if you have those sort of issues, just keep in mind, that an AJAX request does take time, even if it's much faster than a full page refresh. Okay. Yes.
The process attribute in JSF doesn't do the same thing.
Nope, the process attribute, he says, doesn't the process attribute do the same thing? What the process attribute does is it tells the server what to process. So it'll send the whole form, but the JSF will only process whatever components you want it to. So partial submit, all it does is say, I'm not going to send fields JSF's not going to use anyways. So it's really just it's really only going to make more difference on the network side of things, not on the server side. Okay. Any other questions? All right, so let's talk about some gotchas, which basically means things to watch out for. So one of the things to think about are null input values. So in JSF 1.2, null values are converted to 0 or false. And sometimes that can be really annoying. And this can be changed with the context parameter in Tomcat and JBoss. It's the EL parser coerced to 0 equals false. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. You're only going to run into this as an issue if you're upgrading from JSF 1.x. If you're already using JSF 1.2 and everything works fine for JSF 2, then you don't really have to worry about this too much. But also, you can control this behavior in JSF 2 with this particular context parameter. Okay, so here you can basically say, okay, I want empty strings to be null, or I want them not to be. Okay, and that sort of has a big impact on how things work. So, okay, well, that's the same thing. All right, so for validating empty fields, JSF 1.x, validators are called for empty values. Okay, which some people find very annoying because the value is empty. Why are you calling the validator, right? You can turn that off in JSF 1.2 by turning validate empty fields to false. Okay. So a couple things to keep in mind. All right, so here are just a few best practices. So one of the things I like to do is to use constants or enums for method outcomes. So if you're using the standard JSF mechanism where you return a string and the string is matched navigation rules and the navigation rules decide what page to go to, you can actually use an enumerated type or a constant if you don't want to use an enum. Okay. So here's an example. We have an enum. It's called outcome. You have success, failure, previous, next, error. Okay, and it's helpful to have a method like this to override toString, so it's always lowercase. 'Cause by default, it'll be uppercase. Or you can just make the enum values lowercase if you want. It's fine. So that's kind of a handy thing. And then inside of your backing bean, if you have an action method that returns an outcome, you can just actually return an outcome object instead of a string. It's kind of handy. Okay, so it's something I like to do. Now, of course, if you're using Spring Webflow or the implicit navigation in JSF2, where you just return the name of a page, this isn't going to work. But if you're using the JSF navigation rules, this is a handy thing to do. Okay, and I find this makes things a lot more readable. Another a sort of best practice is to build a library of composite components. This one I highly recommend. And what you can do with this is really standardize behavior and look and feel. So for example, you can standardize input control layout. So let's say every input control has a label and the control itself, and the label has a particular CSS selector associated with it. Okay, so you can do that. You can also, let's say you have panels that always look a certain way. Let's say you have buttons that look a certain way, or let's say you have panels, like a button panel or something. Icons, forms, etc. Maybe your toolbars look a certain way. Okay, all of these things are very good candidates for composite components. Another sort of a good example are basically lots of input controls. So for example, let's say that there is a certain way that, well, here's an example. I actually have a client right now. They have input masks, right? And they have an input mask component they're using. And there's a certain set of attributes that are set on every one. And we have to repeat them over and over again, right? Well, maybe if we had a composite component, we could just have to use that composite component. It has all the basic parameters hard-coded, right? And then it takes whatever parameters it needs for anything else. Another common example is a data table. Let's say you have a certain way that a data table looks and behaves in your application, and you want to sort of enforce that in every page. If you make it a composite component, that composite component can have whatever sort of standard properties and attributes and the CSS selectors all of your data tables have. Okay? So this is something I really recommend that you do. Here's an example. This is really simple, but so this is a composite component that just has a label and a value, and it requires that you give it a value. Okay? So basically, all this does is it's going to be it's basically an input component with a label and a value. So it's very simple, right? But you imagine you might put a specific CSS selector here. The other thing this does is it enforces that for every input control, you use the output label component, because some people will put an output text component, which is the wrong component to use for a label. Okay, so there's things you can enforce this way. All right. And it is also possible to package up composite components into a jar file and then distribute it to other teams. Okay, so if you have multiple teams working on JSF applications, you can have a component suite that's used internally, which definitely larger projects, larger companies do. Okay, so that's one recommendation. Here are some development team best practices. These are not all specific to JSF. Some of these are kind of just general. So like documentation, a pretty general thing, right? Try and document something about your application, how it works, help people who are starting out. Coding guidelines I find to be very important in JSF applications because there are often different ways to do the same thing, right? So because of this, having some guidelines about how to do those things goes a long way in ensuring sort of a cohesive way of a cohesive style in your application. Okay. Of course, for code review, there you can course, do manual code reviews, but there's also static analysis tools. So if you look at tools like, what is it called? Forgot the name of it. Anyways, there's some static analysis tools that basically go through your code, and a lot of them have been updated for JSF. So if you have a static analysis tool, and basically by static analysis we mean it looks at your actual code base and finds patterns or problems with it, right? Those are pretty helpful. There's even actually I think Sonar is one of the ones that actually has JSF support built into it. Has anyone ever used Sonar before? Just curious. Okay. Anyone ever used the JSF features? All right. So I think there's a JSF plugin somewhere. I think also JSF Unit, which is a unit integration testing tool, basically, it has some sort of static analysis feature that looks at your artifacts, not your Java code, but like your XHTML file and your configuration files as well. So that's something you can use as well. So I also recommend some sort of build process. How many people here do not have a build script? No build script at all? Anybody? Ah, that's good. All right. So I've been in many shops without them, so it's a good thing. All right, continuous integration I always like, and unit testing. So I want to say a little bit about unit testing. How many people here are using some sort of special JSF unit testing tool? Anybody? Curious, what are you using?
JSF unit.
Okay, so you're not. Anyone else using one? Okay. So the reason you're not using one is because there aren't many of them, right? So there's basically three main options right now. There's JSF Unit, which is a tool from JBoss. It's open source. And what it does is it's kind of unique. It's really more of an integration testing tool. It allows you to, you can write a unit test using JUnit, but what it does is it actually runs in the container and lets you, but also has a web client as well. So you can access the page using Java by grabbing components on the client, and you can also access the server side and look at backing beans and stuff as well. So it's kind of cool because you can do both from the exact same unit test. So it's kind of a nice tool. It takes some work to set it up and get it running. It's probably the biggest problem with it, but it's a pretty good tool. So you might want to take a look at that. Another one is MyFaces test, which is another part of the MyFaces project. And MyFaces test uses mock objects or stubs for all of your JSF objects. So it doesn't require a container. JSF Unit requires to actually, run your application in a container. Okay. MyFaces test, basically what it does is it gives you fake versions of Faces context and application object, etc. It runs very quickly in your IDE. Okay. The caveat, there's two main caveats to it. One is that it doesn't currently read your managed bean configuration or annotations to determine which things are supposed to be available when. So you have to handle all that stuff manually, which is kind of a pain. Well, I guess that's probably the main caveat, to tell you the truth. So I like it for testing sort of more infrastructure level components. It's actually used internally by the MyFaces team to test MyFaces. So it's very good if you're writing composite components or more of low-level framework sort of components. It's okay for doing backing beans, but if you have lots of objects in different scopes or lots of infrastructure that loads at startup in your application, it's not so good for that because it doesn't actually run your application, it just runs whatever class you're testing. So it's pretty good more for straight up unit testing. Okay? So that's MyFaces test. Another choice is Archillion, which is another JBoss project, and that lets you do in-container testing. Okay? The problem with your Archillion is that it's not really aware of JSF per se, but you can test your backing beans and to some degree as long as you're not interfacing with JSF components too much. One of the things you can do is you could, use Archillion for some back-end stuff and then use Selenium or something else on the front end for more black box testing. So how many people here use Selenium or something like that? Okay, so a few of you. Selenium's pretty good for black box testing. So some people, they'll test the UI with the components and stuff on the front end with that. And then, you may want to use just straight up Archillion or something else, or even just JUnit for your back end stuff. So those are some options out there. I like Selenium a lot for front end stuff as well. Yeah, those are basically the main options for JSF unit testing. So, the other thing that you can do actually is you can use a mocking library like Mockito or JMock. Has anyone used those before? Okay, so a few of you. So you can get a lot of mileage out of those if you really use them well. You can build up a library of fake JSF objects and things like that. And so you can basically have, test execute very quickly if you really get to work on sort of building up the infrastructure a bit. Okay. All right. Any questions on these topics? All right. All right. So a couple more things. Try to external messages to resource bundles. By messages, I mean like the text inside of your pages and things like that. This is really something I like to do, but it's really not required unless you have a requirement to support multiple languages. If you need to support multiple languages, you have to put them in resource bundles, right? But even if you don't need to support multiple languages, if you have a larger application, I like to put all of the display strings in a resource bundle or several resource bundles, because it's a lot easier to maintain. Also, if I have different pages that have the same strings on them, I don't have to put it in different pages and then have one developer spell it differently or say it differently than another. It's always in one place. Okay, so in larger applications, I like to have maybe one message bundle that's a global message bundle with different messages, one message bundle, and then maybe one per app per module. Okay, so then there's a central place where all the display strings go, whether it's a label for an input control or a heading on a page. Okay. And then it's very easy to maintain and update. Okay, and then if you do have a requirement to support multiple languages later on, it's very easy to add it as well. Okay, now obviously it's not required in smaller applications, but I do like it as a general best practice. Another thing is if you have a phase listener. How many people have written a phase listener before? Okay, so a handful of you. So a phase listener is sort of a specialized object you can use in JSF to interface with the JSF lifecycle. So you can write a phase listener as many as you want, and they can basically intercept things. They can be executed before or after a particular phase. And the different phases are like invoke application, which happens almost last, but there's restore view, process validations, update model, etc. So before any of those things happen, your phase listener can be executed. Now, one of the things which is a little annoying about phase listeners, though, is that they're singletons, which is not bad, but they don't really have any easy facilities for dealing with state. So sometimes if you have a phase listener which really needs some data, you may want to put that data in a scoped object like a request scoped object or a session scoped object or something like that, because there's only one singleton per application. Okay. All right, and my most important, not most important, but one of my most important pieces of advice is this. All right, so I find a lot of developers just don't read the manual, okay? And whether the manual is the JSF spec or a book or some articles, it helps actually put a little effort into figuring out what you're doing first. So if you're not unsure how to do things, take the time to understand how JSF works so that what you do actually works better, because otherwise you end up making strange workarounds which may work for you today but break very easily later on. Okay? And also you'll know more, which is always a good thing. Okay? So here are some resources. I don't know how many of you know, but there is an official JSF website called JavaServerFaces.org, which has links to the documentation, like the API docs and the spec and stuff like that. JSF Central, of course, is a good resource. And probably the books I recommend right now, since my book is really out of date, or Core JSF and JSF the Complete Reference. Those are probably the two I would recommend. JSF the Complete Reference is by Ed Burns, who's a spec lead. So it's really good as sort of a reference book. Okay, don't read it if you're trying to learn JSF to start with. I think Core JSF is probably a better choice for that. Okay. All right, so we have 26 minutes left for questions. I thought we'd have some time left. So, any questions? I'll come in. Some of you have to have some questions. It doesn't have to be necessarily anti-patterns or best practices. Yes.
I want to ask you a question regarding CDI. You talked a little bit about it before, but what's your take on it? Because at the time of JSF 1.2, I was using SIM in order to have some features that didn't exist in JSF 2. And then JSF 2 came out with ViewScope, which I thought it was really good and was brilliant. But then CDI came out at the same time, and you cannot use ViewScope in CDI unless you go back to SIM and you use the SIM Faces library in order to use ViewScope. So are you going to really delete JavaX Faces management from the scope at a certain moment, or is it going to last?
Yeah. Okay, so just to summarize, what's up with CDI and JSF? That's basically your question.
I think that I might be wrong, and I see that the difference in many ways, but when you get the management from JSF and the management from CDI, I don't see why they should go both, apart from the view scope and a few things like managed properties.
Right, right. Okay, so basically, just for a little bit of history, how many people here have heard of SIEM before? Just curious. Okay, so not all of you. Okay, all right. So basically, if you go back to JSF 1.2 time frame, JSF 1.2 fixed a lot of issues with JSF 1.1, and I think really sort of solidified a lot of the holes. But didn't really add any new features, right? It just fixed some things. Okay. And there's still some other areas that needed improvement, and SIEM was a JBoss project that came along and did all that. It was started by Gavin King, who's the guy that started Hibernate. And it really provided sort of a nice application stack built on top of JSF and filled in all these other gaps and added all these new features. Okay, but probably the number one thing SIEM did was really sort of provide another dependency injection model that worked with EJB and JSF and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Because before that, Spring was sort of the de facto dependency injection model. So what happened is basically this JBoss started a spec, which started out being called WebBeans, and then ended up being called a much more memorable name like Context for Dependency Injection in Java, or CDI for short, basically to take a lot of the features from SIEM and standardize them. Okay. However, it kind of morphed over time. Another one of the main contributors was the guy that came up with Juice, which is a Google dependency injection framework. Okay, so it changed a lot over time. What we ended up with was a CDI spec, okay, which is actually really cool. Provides a lot, basically, really powerful dependency injection for a Java EE, and is similar to Spring in a lot of ways. Okay, the problem is that CDI didn't really go far enough to cover all the features that SIEM did. Okay, so SIEM had sort of a view sort of scope built into it. SIEM had a really good conversation scope built into it, and the CDI version of the conversation scope doesn't work very well with JSF out of the box, and there is, as he said, there's really no view scope, right? So then what happened was different open source projects started filling in those gaps in CDI. So there's SIEM Faces, which is part of SIEM 3, and there's also My Faces Cody, which is CDI extensions. Okay, and they started providing extra features on top of CDI to integrate with JSF. Okay, so the short answer is today, if you want to use CDI, you pretty much have to use SIEM Faces or My Faces Cody. With JSF to really get the most out of it. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. And as a matter of fact, there's now a new project called Delta Spike, which is basically combining all the CDI extensions together into one project. It's actually an Apache project. So a lot of those extensions are going to end up being in Delta Spike and eventually probably becoming a standard part of CDI or JSF. Okay, so I don't think there's any problem with using CDI and JSF together. Just recognize you're going to have to use one of those libraries, okay, to really get the most out of it. Now, long term, there's sort of an issue here because when JSF started, there was no dependency injection in Java and Java EE at all, right? So that's why they added managed beans. And managed beans is really very simple dependency injection. It doesn't use any proxying, doesn't do transactions, doesn't do any sort of interceptions. You can't write interceptors for it or anything like that. It's very simple. So basically, as now the CDI is in the picture, this whole managed bean concept is weird because JSF has its own dependency injection, and then the CDI is essentially the dependency injection framework for all of Java EE. So the plan eventually will be to get rid of managed beans and everybody will just use CDI, but that hasn't happened yet because there's all these edge cases that managed beans work better for. So I can tell you that managed beans will not go away in the JSF 2.1 time frame. JSF 2.1 will be out, I think, sometime this year. Okay, this managed beans will be around then. They might go away after that, maybe after Java E7 comes out, which I think is 2013. Maybe after that, managed beans will go away, but they're going to be here for a while. Okay, they'll probably be around until we're confident that CDI covers all of the use cases that managed beans cover. And one of the edge cases we ran into was portlets. CDI doesn't work too well in portlets, just because the people that wrote the reference implementation for CDI didn't bother adding portlet support. so if we got rid of managed beans, you wouldn't be able to write a portlet and use at all, really. so there are some edge cases. So long answer, but hopefully that helps. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Yes.
What about scalability? GSF scalability.
Okay.
It's quite heavy.
Yes. So the question is, what about scalability? So you said JSF is quite heavy. Okay. And it can be, and this is why I mentioned that giant view as an anti-pattern, because that often contributes to it. The reason JSF can be heavy is because of the state, right? It's a stateful component framework. So every component that you create has a server-side object that also has the value of the object as well. Okay. Now it is possible to make it pretty large applications with it, right? There are a lot that aren't. Usually, it's used more for applications which are behind some sort of login. So, for instance, Geico, which is a major insurance company in the U.S., they use it for stuff. It's actually used in a lot of insurance companies. And there are a lot of larger sites, but usually it's behind a login. It's not like on a power like Google or something like that, right? So I think one of the keys to scalability are a lot of the things I talked about, like trying to keep your component tree smaller, put your objects in the right scope, because really the scalability issue is much more about the session size than anything else. Because normally in a larger application, you're going to have a cluster, right? And so you don't want to put everything in the session because then that has to be replicated across all the clusters, and that's expensive, right? So that's one of the things. Another thing is keeping an eye on how many views you keep. So by default, the number of views JSF keeps is 15 or 20, depending on the implementation. That may be a lot more than you need. So just by reducing that number, you could drastically reduce the session scope or session size of the session. Another thing is that you can use more stateless components, or so maybe you don't need an output text to display display some text on the page. You can just put the expression in the page and display the data, right? So if the more transient components you use, the smaller the size of your component tree, right? So that's another thing you can do. Also, there is a project called Stateless JSF you may want to look at. It's another open source project. And basically, what it does is I think it tries to make all of the pages stateless. Not really sure how it works, but I'm sure it would probably speed things up a bit. But those are kind of the main issues. Now, if the problem you're having is more on the front end, then those are things that are much easier to tweak, like which component suite you're using, how big your IDs are, those sorts of things. But most of the scalability issues have to do with session state. The other thing you could do is you can use client-side state saving. So for any state in JSF, you can store it in the server, which is default, or on the client. There are other issues that pop up with that, but that is something you can look at as well. So that's a long-winded answer. I think long-term, the best solution for us is to really provide more options for stateless pages. So where we don't actually keep the state of the component for the display of the page. So
That's the way JSF goes.
it doesn't have to, though.
Do you think they will change this paradigm?
Well, that's what I'm saying. In the long term, I think that's where it should go. It's happening. Yeah, it's not happening in the 2.1 time frame, but long term, I think that's probably where it'll go. I think in the short term, if that's really what you're looking for, you should look at an open source project. You might probably see what the story is with it.
Not using JSF. That's what you want to say. Not using JSF.
No, the project I mentioned is JSF. It's just an add-on. So the project I'm talking about, basically, it's an add-on that makes all the views stateless in JSF.
You
So.
cannot say such things to clients. I mean, it's an open source project that can go and come in 1 year and you don't know what the future is. You cannot sell this to a client. You have to sell them something stable.
This is true.
JSF is stable.
Yes.
Specifications behind, so that's the right thing.
Right. So in that case, I would say look at some of the strategies I mentioned before. Okay. And I think if you pay attention to a lot of those things, you can really go a long way. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Okay. So thank you very much for coming. I think this will be probably on Parlays or something eventually. And if you have any other questions, you can come up afterwards. And I guess that's it. So thanks a lot for coming.